If the Japanese found the radio, the men who had built it died. Everyone who knew it existed died. That's why nobody talked about it. And that's why it worked for years. I spent weeks going through AWM archives, Australian prisoner diaries, and veteran testimonies to bring you this documentary. What you're about to hear happened inside a Japanese prison camp, with stolen parts, under threat of immediate execution. And for years, nobody who wasn't supposed to know about it did. On the 15th of February 1942, General Arthur Percival signed the surrender of Singapore. 85,000 Allied soldiers captured in what Churchill called the greatest disaster in British military history. Of those 85,000, almost 15,000 were Australian, 14,972 according to the records. The bulk of the 8th Australian Division, the 22nd Brigade and the 27th Brigade, the battalions that had fought through Malaya for weeks before falling back to the island. Artillery, engineers, signals, medical units. Everything Australia had in Southeast Asia, captured in a day. On the 17th of February 1942, 2 days after the surrender, the marches began. The Australians walked east, toward the Changi Peninsula at the eastern tip of Singapore Island, toward Selarang Barracks. Selarang Barracks had been built by the British in 1936. Brick buildings, permanent infrastructure. A camp that compared to what the Japanese would build in Burma, in Borneo, in Thailand, had materially superior conditions. What that meant in practice is something survivors took decades to speak about. Rice rations with very little protein, scarce water, intestinal diseases, beriberi, malaria, overcrowding in buildings designed for half the men now occupying them. Conditions superior to other Japanese camps. That killed 850 men anyway. The Japanese allowed daily administration to remain in the hands of Allied officers themselves. Ration distribution, internal discipline, work organisation. Within those limits, the Australians built something that no Japanese prison camp had fully anticipated. A community, gardens in the spaces between buildings, a makeshift hospital that Australian doctors turned into something more functional than any prison camp structure should have been. And informal university courses, lectures, classes that kept men mentally active when their bodies had little to do. And something else. Something the Japanese didn't know existed. That they couldn't know existed. Because if they had known, the men who had built it would have died. In August 1942, something happened that defined the relationship between the Australian prisoners and their captors, with a clarity that no other incident captured as completely. The Japanese demanded that prisoners sign a declaration, committing not to escape. The Allied officers refused. Signing that declaration was contrary to military honour, contrary to international law. A prisoner of war has not only the right, but the duty to attempt escape. Signing that they wouldn't was exactly the kind of capitulation that the Australian military code couldn't accept. The Japanese responded by concentrating more than 15,000 prisoners in the Selarang Barracks parade ground. 15,000 men in a space designed for a fraction of that number. 4 days. Without sufficient water, without adequate sanitary facilities, with Singapore's equatorial heat in August. Until Allied commanders made the only decision possible to avoid a mass sanitary catastrophe, they agreed to sign. Under explicit coercion, with a formal note that the signature was made under duress and had no moral validity. But they signed. And when they returned to the Selarang Barracks, what they knew about the Japanese was different from what they had known before those 4 days. Not that they were capable of cruelty, they already knew that, but that they were willing to apply mass suffering to 15,000 men simultaneously to get what they wanted, and that the life of an Australian prisoner in Changi depended on the will of a system that had just demonstrated exactly what it was capable of. By 1943, only approximately 2,500 Australian prisoners remained in Changi. The rest had been loaded onto hell ships toward forced labour projects, toward the Death Railway in Burma and Thailand, toward Borneo, toward Sumatra, toward Japan. More than 7,000 Australians would die as prisoners in total. Those who remained in Changi were the ones the Japanese had selected to stay. And among them was a group who had built something that no Japanese guard had yet found, that no Japanese record mentioned. That existed only in the knowledge of the men who had built it and the few who needed to know it was there. How they built it, where they hid it, and what information reached them through it for years while the world outside the camp fought a war they could only hear is what comes next. Every morning in Changi started the same way. The count, prisoners formed up, guards counted, and when the number matched, the day began with the distribution of rice rations. White rice, with small quantities of vegetables, occasionally some fish or meat, a diet that the Australian doctors in the camp documented with the precision of men who knew that what they were recording was going to matter after the war. Insufficient in calories, insufficient in protein, insufficient in vitamins, enough not to die immediately. After the count and rations, the men assigned to working parties went out. Ports, warehouses, construction sites, work under Japanese supervision, outside the camp perimeter, in contact with the outside world in a way that inside Changi was impossible. Those who didn't go out stayed, cooking, cleaning, tending the improvised hospital, working in the gardens they had planted in the spaces between buildings, mending clothes, repairing footwear, the small and endless tasks of men who needed their hands to do something so their minds didn't dwell too long on where they were. The Australian doctors in Changi documented what a rice diet did to human bodies with a systematicism that, in other circumstances, would have been medical research. In Changi, it was clinical survival. Beriberi came first. Thiamine deficiency, oedema ankles, legs, abdomen swelling with fluid the body couldn't process correctly, extreme weakness, nerve damage that, in advanced cases, made walking impossible. In a prison camp where working was mandatory and not working had consequences, beriberi wasn't just a disease. It was a sentence. Pellagra followed. Niacin deficiency, dermatitis that turned skin into something that hurt at contact, chronic diarrhea that emptied the body of the little the rice diet gave it. And in the most serious cases, mental disorders, confusion, dementia, that Australian doctors observed and documented, knowing they didn't have the nutrients to treat them. Malaria recurred again and again, tropical ulcers, intestinal infections. A human body subjected to systematic malnutrition in a tropical climate without sufficient medicines doesn't collapse all at once. It deteriorates, week by week, month by month, in ways that the men who lived it described in their diaries with a precision that decades later is still difficult to read. But in Changi, something happened that no prison camp system had been designed to produce. The Australians built a society. Not in the abstract sense, in the very concrete sense that they identified what they needed to survive as human beings, not just as bodies that needed calories and built it with what they had. The informal University of Changi emerged from the same logic that had produced the elastic retreat at Kokoda, without anyone ordering it, from the men themselves. Prisoners with legal training offered law classes, doctors taught medicine, engineers explained physics, linguists gave language courses, not to obtain a qualification, to keep active the part of the brain that processes the future, to preserve the narrative that there would be an after this, that the knowledge they were acquiring was going to be useful for something when it was all over. The AWM documents that the study programs were relatively systematic, not improvisation, curricula, timetables, examinations, in a Japanese prison camp, with scarce paper and without enough books, because the alternative, letting minds dwell on the camp's reality, produced something that Australian doctors documented as equally dangerous as beriberi, despair. And then there was the theatre. The AWM preserves the records of Changi's theatre companies with a specificity that captures something no survival analysis could have fully predicted. Comedies, musical reviews, dramatic works, choral concerts, with handwritten scripts, sets built from whatever was available, costumes improvised in ways that in any other circumstance would have been comical, and that in Changi were something more. The veterans who described those theatre nights to the AWM used a phrase that repeats with enough consistency that it isn't coincidence. For a few hours, I forgot where I was. Not the camp, not the guards, not the rice rations, not the beriberi in the ankles of the man sleeping beside him. For a few hours, just the stage. And tomorrow the count would start again, and the rice rations, and the working parties. But tonight there had been theatre. In the Japanese prison camps, a clandestine radio wasn't contraband. It was espionage. Japanese camp regulations classified radios, maps, and any means of contact with Allied forces in the same category. Direct contact with the enemy. And the punishment for direct contact with the enemy wasn't isolation. It wasn't extra work. It wasn't reduced rations. It was torture. And if the Japanese decided the situation required it, if they wanted to send a message to the rest of the prisoners, it was death. On the 2nd of September 1942, 4 men were executed on Changi Beach. Corporal Rodney Brevington, Australian. Private Victor Gale, Australian. Harold Waters, British. Eric Fletcher, British. They had tried to escape. They had been recaptured, they had been summarily tried, and the Japanese had organised what followed with a deliberation that left no ambiguity about its purpose. Allied officers were forced to witness the execution, not as voluntary spectators, as a coerced audience, as part of the message that General Shinpei Fukuye wanted delivered without possibility of alternative interpretation. This is what happens when you defy the system. This is what will happen to the next one who tries something similar. The bodies were displayed, and the Australian prisoners who had seen that, who had been present or who had learned about it from those who were present, returned to their Selarang barracks with something that no psychological analysis can fully capture. The concrete and specific knowledge of what it meant if the Japanese found the radio. Lieutenant R. Wright was from Hawthorne, Victoria. The AWM archives record him with that geographical precision that Australian military documents use to anchor men in the place they came from. Hawthorne, Victoria. A Melbourne suburb. Houses with gardens. Trams. The kind of ordinary life that in 1942 was 12,000 kilometres away, and separated by a war that nobody in Hawthorne knew exactly how it was going. The archives describe him as a man with great technical skill, a tinkerer, someone who takes things apart to understand how they work and puts them back together in ways not in the original manual. In civilian life, that skill has useful but non-urgent applications. In Changi in 1942, under threat of execution, that skill was the difference between knowing what was happening in the outside world and not knowing. Wright decided they were going to know. The parts didn't come from any supplier. They came from the scrap that prisoners found on working parties outside the camp, from civilian equipment abandoned when the Japanese took Singapore, from dismantled telephones, from military material the Japanese hadn't fully collected. Small parts, individual components, that someone brought back into the camp concealed in clothing, in shoes, in any space that a superficial search wouldn't reach. Wright built several receivers. Not one. Several different versions and models that the AWM documents with photographs taken in September 1945, still intact, still working, still undiscovered by any Japanese guard after 3 years of operation. Shortwave receivers of extremely small size. Optimized for one thing only: to fit where nobody would look for them. The AWM documents 3 main hiding places: the head of a broom, the inside of a clock, a hollow table leg. Ordinary objects. Objects that any Japanese guard would see dozens of times a day without there being any reason to look at them with more attention than any other item in the camp. A broom was a broom. A clock was a clock. A table leg was a table leg. And inside each of them, minimal wiring, components soldered onto improvised bases, a receiver capable of picking up shortwave signals from the other side of the world. But Wright built something more. A radio that fit in a water bottle. Not to stay in Changi. To travel. The AWM archives document that Wright built receivers specifically designed to be sent with practically every working party that left Changi for Thailand. The men going to the death railway. The ones who weren't coming back to Changi. The ones who were going to build the railway the Japanese needed for their Burma campaign at the cost of thousands of Allied prisoner lives. Those men took the water bottle, and in the water bottle travelled the radio. Listening to the radio in Changi wasn't what listening to the radio means in any other context. There were no headphones for everyone. There wasn't enough volume for a room full of men. The receiver had to be close to someone's ear, in silence, with the camp's darkness as the only protection against the possibility of a guard passing at the wrong moment. What came from the receiver was the BBC. News bulletins, war reports. The voice of a broadcaster in London describing what was happening in theatres of operations that the Changi prisoners could only see on the mental map they had built from what they knew before being captured. North Africa, Europe, the Pacific. Information the Japanese didn't want them to have. That they couldn't have if the Japanese knew they had it. And through that radio, the Australian prisoners in Changi learned things that changed something fundamental in the camp's psychological dynamics. They learned that El Alamein had changed the course of the war in North Africa. They learned that Stalingrad had destroyed German offensive capability in the east. They learned that the Pacific was changing, that the Japanese were losing ground, that the war that when they arrived at Changi seemed to be tilting irremediably toward Tokyo was turning. Not fast. Not in a way they could see the end clearly from 1942 or 1943. But turning. The information left the receiver and circulated through the camp in ways the archives describe with enough detail to understand the system's sophistication. Not posters, not announcements, quiet conversations. Men who knew what the radio listener had heard, telling the next one who needed to know. A network of information built on the same logic as the radio itself. That it existed, that it worked, and that nobody who wasn't supposed to know about it knew it existed. And Wright was never discovered. The receivers he built kept working until September 1945, when AWM photographers filmed them still intact in the hiding places where they had spent 3 years. In the broomhead. Inside the clock. In the hollow table leg. Exactly where he had put them. If this story is pulling you in, now is the time to subscribe to the channel. Every week we publish documentaries about the Australian military stories that history books don't tell. One click, and you won't miss any of them. The circuit always started the same way. Someone listened to the radio. Not in a group. Not with enough volume for more than one person to hear at a time. The receiver close to the ear, in silence, with the camp's darkness as the only protection. The archives document 3 levels in the system that Wright and the men operating the network had built. The first were the direct listeners, those who heard the BBC bulletin, who mentally noted the essentials, fronts, dates, cities, names, and emerged from the listening moment with that information stored in memory. The second were the trusted officers and NCOs. The direct listeners told them the essentials, synthesized, without revealing the source, without saying where the radio was or how the information had arrived. The third was the dissemination to the rest. Not announcements, not posters, not formal meetings that could be reported. Quiet conversations. Talks about discipline and hope where the news arrived integrated in something any Japanese guard who overheard would have interpreted as a routine morale talk. By trickle, until the essentials had reached everyone who needed to know them. Without anyone who wasn't supposed to know about the radio knowing it existed, in November 1942, the news of El Alamein reached Changi. Not as a newspaper headline, not as an official communiqué, as a whisper travelling from man to man through the Selarang barracks with the precision of a system designed to leave no trace. Montgomery's 8th Army had broken the Afrika Korps lines in North Africa. Rommel in retreat. Churchill called it the end of the beginning. And in Changi, where the Australians had spent 9 months knowing the war outside continued but unable to know which way it was going, that news produced something that veteran testimonies describe with the precision of something they never forgot. The sense that the tide had turned. The AWM archives document something that survival analyses in captivity rarely capture with this specificity. That, after major favourable news, the tone of theatrical performances in Changi changed. Jokes about Hitler were introduced, about Mussolini, about the Axis leaders whose fall the clandestine radio had announced before any Japanese guard in Changi knew, the prisoners knew. The theatre that existed to forget the camp's reality incorporated the reality of the outer war. Because that outer reality was, for the first time since February 1942, a reality that could be told with hope. And the news kept coming. Stalingrad in February 1943. The German 6th Army captured 300,000 men, the greatest German military defeat of the war. That news arrived at Changi through the same circuit. The direct listener, the trusted officers, dissemination by trickle. And when it reached the men in the barracks, what it produced was something the Australian doctors in the camp could measure in indirect but consistent ways. Men who had a perspective on the future lasted longer. Not in an abstract sense. In a clinical and specific sense. The doctors and commanders who knew what the radio was bringing could calculate how much time remained, could organise talks, could tell a man who had spent weeks unable to get up because of beriberi that it was worth holding on because things outside were changing. The invasion of Italy. The fall of Mussolini in July 1943. D-Day in June 1944. The Allied advance toward Berlin. The German surrender in May 1945. Each piece of news reached Changi before any official Japanese source confirmed it, before the guards knew, the prisoners knew. Because Wright kept operating his radio in the broom head, in the table leg, inside the clock, without being discovered, but the information was never perfect. Broadcasts arrived with interference. The receivers picked up fragments. The interpretation of what had been heard could amplify in the 3-level circuit in ways that produced rumours that then had to be corrected. There were moments when hope got ahead of reality. When someone interpreted a piece of news as announcing a liberation that was closer than it was, and then the camp's reality continued. The morning count, the rice rations, the beriberi in the ankles of the man sleeping beside you. And you had to recalibrate. But even with that margin of error, even with the rumours and the false hopes and the moments when the camp's reality crushed what the radio had suggested might happen, the essential function held. The AWM archives capture it with a phrase that appears in multiple testimonies in different forms, but always says the same thing. It told us we weren't forgotten. That outside there was a war that continued, that our armies were still fighting, that our families didn't know exactly where we were, but that the world we belonged to hadn't collapsed. That staying alive made sense. On the 15th of August 1945, Japan announced its surrender. In Changi, the Australians knew before the Japanese guards had received formal instructions about what to do. Wright's radio was still working. The 3-level circuit that had functioned for 3 years transmitted the news with the same discretion with which it had transmitted all the others. But this time it was different. This time it wasn't El Alamein, it wasn't Stalingrad, it wasn't Normandy. It was the end. The Japanese authorities in Singapore maintained formal control of the camp until Allied units entered the city in early September. 3 more weeks. 3 weeks in which the men of Changi knew the war had ended, but the Japanese guards were still there. The rules still applied. The radio that had survived 3 years without being discovered still had to survive 3 more weeks. Wright kept it hidden. In the broom head, in the table leg, inside the clock, exactly where it had been from the beginning. On the 5th of September, 1945, Allied troops assumed control of Changi. And on the 13th of September, the Australian hospital ship Menunda arrived in Singapore. The first Australian ship to arrive to repatriate the men who had been in Changi since February 1942, the photographs of that embarkation are what the AWM archives preserve as the most honest document of what Changi had done to Australian bodies. Extremely thin men, atrophied muscles, sunken faces, 3.5 years of insufficient rice rations, beriberi, pellagra, recurring malaria, work under Japanese supervision with bodies operating on a fraction of the calories they needed. Alive. But not the same men who had marched toward Changi in February 1942. Of the approximately 15,000 Australians captured in Singapore, several thousand had not survived. Those who had been sent to the death railway in Burma and Thailand, those who had gone to Borneo, Sumatra, Japan on the Hell ships. More than 8,000 Australians died as Japanese prisoners in total. Those who survived, those who reached the Menunda, and the other ships and aircraft that followed, carried in their bodies the marks of what they had lived. And in their memory, something harder to document, but equally real. What the post-war Australian doctors documented in the men who came back from Changi is what we would recognise today without difficulty. Post-traumatic stress disorder, recurring nightmares, intrusive memories, anxiety that had no clear object but was always there, difficulties readapting to a civilian life that had continued without them for 3.5 years. And something more that veteran testimonies describe with a consistency that is still difficult to read decades later. The feeling that nobody outside fully understood what it had been. That post-war Australian society busy rebuilding itself, celebrating victory, trying to return to normality, didn't have the space or the language to process what the Changi men were bringing with them. That the guilt of having survived when so many didn't was something that had no place in any conversation that Australia in 1945 was ready to have. In September 1945, AWM photographers filmed the radio receivers Wright had built. Still in their hiding places. The broom head, the table leg, the inside of the clock. 3 years without being discovered, without any Japanese search finding them, without any guard looking closely enough at the ordinary object concealing something that could have gotten them all killed. The receivers are in the AWM collection, documented, preserved, with the description the archives give them, built by Lieutenant R. Wright of Hawthorne, Victoria. In the post-war years, Changi acquired in Australian culture the weight of a symbol that goes beyond the specific facts of a prison camp in Singapore. Russell Braddon wrote The Naked Island in 1952. James Clavell wrote King Rat in 1962, adapted to film. Read by generations of Australians who had no direct connection to the camp, but who, through those pages, understood something about what their fathers or grandfathers had lived that those men rarely spoke aloud. A chapel associated with Selarang was transferred to the Royal Military College at Duntroon and rebuilt as part of the National Memorial to Prisoners of War. A physical structure, a place to go, because Changi was in Singapore. And Singapore wasn't Australia, and the men who had been there needed there to be some place in their own country where what they had lived had a physical presence. When the Singapore government decided to demolish the old Changi prison in 2004, the reaction in Australia was that of a country that felt something belonging to it was being destroyed. A wall with the original gate was preserved. Artefacts were sent to Canberra and veterans associations. Because Changi wasn't simply a place in Singapore. It was the word Australians used to name something that had no other word to fully capture it. What happened to 15,000 Australians between February 1942 and September 1945, and what some of them did within that time to stay sane. There's something about this story that the memorials don't fully capture. Not the numbers, not the diseases, not the Selarang incident or the executions of the 2nd of September. It's this. A man from Hawthorne, Victoria, built a radio from scrap parts. He hid it in the head of a broom. And for 3 years, while the Japanese did their rounds and counted the prisoners and searched the barracks, that radio picked up the BBC from the other side of the world. And what came through the airwaves, fragmented, sometimes imprecise, always risky, was the only thing some men needed to decide it was worth holding on. The receivers are in the AWM collection, still in the hiding places where Wright put them, built by Lieutenant R. Wright of Hawthorne, Victoria, the man who was never discovered, and who almost nobody remembers today. If this channel is telling you stories you haven't heard before, subscribe now. We're a small channel building something big. Every subscriber matters, and the next documentary is already ready. There's another story just as buried as this one. Another group of Australians who built something with what they didn't have in a different theatre, with consequences that also changed something bigger than any of them could see from where they were. It's in the next video.